Doorbells at Dusk. Edited by Evans Light. Associate editors are Gregor Xane, Jason Parent, Adam Light, Rusty Husk. By Evans Light. The man was closer to heaven than he'd ever been, hung up high on a pole in the middle of a vast cornfield. Probably the closest he'd ever get to those pearly gates, he figured. Even though the burning sun rising before him was a reminder of where he was most likely headed, the warmth of it on his face was a pleasure far greater than any he'd experienced in the previous year. A leather strap was looped under his armpits, holding him tight, allowing him to take in the rolling brown pastures spread out below. It was the last thing he'd ever see, he knew, but was satisfied. A vulture landed with a flutter on his shoulder, drawn by the rotten stench of his flesh. The man remained motionless, unblinking, as the bundle of glistening black feathers shuffled closer to his face, long pink neck craning forward, a single beady eye hungrily examining his own. He braced himself, waiting for the thin veil that separates the world of the living from the darkness beyond to be torn away. He wasn't afraid. Fear had long since lost its power. After the pain and suffering he'd endured, he yearned for his soul to be unfettered from this rotting husk of flesh. The ravenous bird, unable to restrain itself any longer, began to peck at his eye with agonizing insistence. As the man's vision failed, suffering dissolved into relief. At last, he would be free. Death was close at hand, and he welcomed it with open arms. Other vultures circled above, hissing excitement. The world was swallowed up in darkness as the bird on his shoulder plucked out his remaining eye. Whether the warm viscous fluid streaming down his cheeks was blood or tears, the man didn't know and didn't care. He only wanted it all to end. "How do you do it?" neighbors asked. "It looks so real, like it could jump right up and grab you." The rocking chair scarecrow was the crown jewel of Mr. Rusty Husk's menagerie of Halloween decorations, one that struck fear into the hearts of children and adults alike. Halloween was his absolute favorite holiday, and each October for the last decade Rusty had made a new scarecrow. He took extreme pride in his handiwork. A menacing jack-o'-lantern had perched atop its shoulders. This year's scarecrow was dressed in a traditional manner, sporting farmer dungarees and a plaid flannel shirt stuffed to bursting with hay. Its wrists and ankles were bound to the rocking chair with metal shackles. Thick chains wrapped around the scarecrow's torso completed the illusion that any visitor would experience a swift and certain death if the monster wasn't forcibly restrained. Rusty hated to end his annual scarecrow tradition, but this year was to be the last. Having recently celebrated his 50th birthday, Rusty thought it time to quit while he was ahead. After weeks of anticipation, Halloween finally arrived. As the fat autumn sun vanished below the horizon, clusters of costumed children began to roam the sidewalks. Bucket of candy in hand, Rusty was ready for them. His house was always a draw, and that night was no exception. Scores of trick-or-treaters stopped by to beg for candy and endure his scarecrow, some reacting with frightened squeals, others with nervous laughter. His infamous rocking porch scarecrow seemed to rattle even the bravest among them. Rusty took his sweet time, letting them shiver beneath the scarecrow's dark glare. He figured the kids enjoyed being scared, even if they didn't know it. The frightening moments he provided could very well be the most vivid childhood memories they'd have in old age. Those would be gifts he'd given them. His neighbor, Luther, an elderly man whose gravelly voice made him sound like a pack-a-day guy even though he claimed not to smoke, eventually stopped by to inspect the final scarecrow, as he did every Halloween. Ever thought about putting yourself in that rocking chair, dressed up as the scarecrow? He said with a sandpaper drawl. Sit real still and then jump up and grab people when they least expect it? I saw somebody do that once. Scared the shit out of me. Rusty had never done that cheap trick and had told Luther as much, many times and in no uncertain terms. Yet Luther asked him that same question every year, and eventually the conversation had become an annual ritual between them. As evening became night, the number of trick-or-treaters dwindled until, eventually, the doorbells ceased to ring at all. Rusty shook the cauldron-shaped bucket, pleased to hear a few remaining Halloween treats sliding around inside. He cocked a smile at the scarecrow chained down in the rocking chair. Just enough left over for you and me, Bertha. The scarecrow didn't respond, of course. Its carved pumpkin eyes stared straight ahead, dark and unseeing. The rocking chair, firmly bolted down as a deterrent to pranksters, sat motionless. Fine, be that way. More for me, Rusty said. Neighbors often asked why he didn't simply reuse his scarecrows, since each was so perfectly creepy. He'd never answered these questions directly, preferring to dodge with a smile and an oft-repeated story. Every morning after Halloween, he'd go onto the porch to take his coffee and the scarecrow would be gone. Split for the cornfields, I suppose. He'd chuckle in a genial way, and that was the end of that. The truth was, after trick-or-treating was done, he'd turn off the porch light, unlock the chains, and swiftly pull it into the house. There, behind tightly drawn curtains, he'd wrap it up tight, drive it down to the abandoned lots on Shady Lane for a one-way trip through the chipper, the same one he used to mulch the neighbors' Christmas trees in winter. He'd gotten the scarecrow's disposal down to a science over the years, and the process hadn't failed him yet. Rusty glanced at his watch as he stood on the porch, sucking a Tootsie Pop. He scanned for stragglers, but the block was empty and the night silent. Deciding that Halloween was officially over, he called time of death as 10 p.m., flipped off the light, and stepped inside, kicking the door closed behind him. He went to the garage to fetch the cleanup equipment. Sometimes the slightest niggle of worry would strike, but it hadn't this year. So what if I allow myself one little thrill? Is that really so bad? He thought while digging through storage bins for a tarp and some duct tape. Anyway, this was it, the last one, the very last scarecrow. He went into the living room and dropped the duct tape and tarp onto the sofa. After pushing the coffee table to one side to clear space in which to work, he started towards the front porch, but ended up in the kitchen for some coffee instead. He was procrastinating. Getting rid of the scarecrow was the single thing he hated about Halloween. Once he finished his coffee, Rusty grabbed his keys and headed to the front porch to unlock the scarecrow from its display. The doorbell rang as he touched the front door, the unexpected chime jolting him as if the knob was electric. Who could possibly be visiting this late? He was irritated by the intrusion. The porch light was off, and that was a cardinal rule of Halloween. Lights out, no more candy, end of story. He decided it was best to simply move the late visitor along, so he grabbed the candy bucket and opened the door. "You almost missed out," he said, wearing his friendliest smile. No one was there. A haunted soundtrack of anguished moans and howling wolves floated across the yard from the speakers he'd hidden among the decorations in his front yard. Flashing lights painted the fog purple and orange as it billowed from the machine and rolled down the stairs. Rusty stepped onto the empty porch into the autumn night. The darkness was still as death. He frowned. Something felt wrong. Invisible fingertips crawled along his back as he turned towards the scarecrow. The rocking chair was empty. A mess of scattered straw littered the floor where the scarecrow had been. It had been on his porch for weeks. Seldom had an hour passed without him checking on it. With all the bolts and chains, no one could have absconded with his scarecrow without raising a holy ruckus. But the chair was empty all the same, as if the scarecrow had just gotten up and walked away. As Rusty pondered what to do, a shuffle from behind drew his attention. He spun about and found the scarecrow's dark jack-o'-lantern eyes waiting for him. It was taller than he remembered, the formerly hay-stuffed body grown thick and burly. Cords of muscle flexed beneath flannel sleeves, stretching the seams as the pumpkin head loomed above him. An enormous hand clamped over Rusty's mouth before he could make a sound. The fingers of the scarecrow's other hand coiled around his neck, lifting him from the ground and thrusting him through the front door with a single violent shove. The scarecrow clomped inside behind him, slamming the door closed. Rusty lashed out, frantic, fists pummeling the pumpkin head, smashing it into a pulpy mush. Pieces fell away as the pair moved into the living room. Rusty dug his fingers into a slimy chunk of pumpkin flesh, taking it with him as the scarecrow hurled him to the floor, the impact with hardwood knocking the wind from his lungs. He put himself up on his knees, discovering that his assailant was no supernatural being, no scarecrow come to life, as he'd subconsciously feared. It was only a man, a giant hunk of a man, whose beard was covered in strands of gooey pumpkin guts from the makeshift helmet he'd worn during the brief confrontation. The man's eyes burned with a fury brighter than any jack-o'-lantern Rusty had ever seen. As Rusty struggled to his feet, a fist pounded into his face, sending him back down in a shower of stars. Rusty felt hands on him, his arms twisted so hard behind him he feared they'd be wrenched from his body. Gritty carpet fibers pressed between his lips. Duct tape ripped loudly, the tightness of it felt first around his wrists, then his ankles. Then around his head it went. 1, 2, 3 times, the tape sealing his mouth. The man kicked Rusty onto his back, bashing his head against the floor. The intruder snatched the tarp from the couch, spread it out, and dumped Rusty onto it. The man dropped to his knees, straddling Rusty. He leaned forward to growl a single word into Rusty's ear. "Stay." Rusty obeyed, immobile and trembling as the man's footsteps echoed away into the foyer. The front door squeaked open and slammed closed. The sudden silence of the empty house was almost as jarring as the unexpected assault. What to do? Make a break for it? Not likely with found limbs. He tried to remember where he'd put his phone. The kitchen, perhaps? Even if he got on his feet and hopped into the kitchen before the man returned, what could he possibly hope to do? How could he unlock his phone with his hands bound behind his back, much less call for help? Perhaps this was nothing more than a run-of-the-mill robbery, and the man would simply take what he wanted and hit the road, leaving Rusty tied up for the neighbors to find him later. He desperately wanted to believe that, but the fury, the purposefulness of the man's movements, had told a different story. Before Rusty could settle on a plan of action, time ran out. The front door squeaked open and slammed closed once more as approaching footsteps grew ever louder. Rusty turned to find a pair of dirty work boots inches from his nose. A bright red metal toolbox slammed onto the floor, tools jangling inside. Clasps were flipped and the lid was lifted. The man retrieved a small ball-peen hammer and an odd-looking spike, bluntly tapered at one end, flat on the other. The man set the hammer down and sat atop Rusty once again, pinning him to the floor. Calloused fingers pressed firmly into Rusty's spine, starting at the back of the neck and working their way down, vertebrae by vertebrae, as if carefully counting. The man's probing fingers came to a stop several inches below Rusty's neck, holding their position until replaced by cold steel. Rusty struggled to free himself as the man reached for the hammer, but to no avail. Shadows scurried along the wall as the man brought the hammer up and swung it back down, striking the spike with a sharp ting. In that instant, Rusty's body burned as if he'd been stabbed with a billion needles and set aflame. A scream burst from his lungs, but the tape over his mouth redirected the exhalation through his nostrils where it exited with nothing more than a snort. His agony swelled to a crescendo of searing pain before ebbing away into a vague sense of nothingness, departing as quickly as it had arrived. The man kicked a boot beneath Rusty's ribcage, flipping him over to stare at the ceiling. Rusty tried to roll over, to crawl away, but his body had hardened into cement. He was lying atop taped wrists and hands, but he no longer felt them beneath him. He had the sensation that his body was melting into the floor. Hysteria surged, triggering a wave of nausea that threatened to sweep him away. He was being suffocated by the duct tape, used-up air welling up inside him. Rusty looked towards the man, his head the only part of his body still obeying orders. He wanted to beg for mercy, but his lips were sealed. The intruder fiddled with something just out of view, ignoring him. Rusty closed his eyes to calm himself, get control of his breathing, slow his pounding heart. He told himself everything would be okay, that he was going to make it out of this alive. Hands tugged at his hair, lifting his head from the floor. A plastic brace was slipped around his neck and locked into place with a loud click. The room spun as vertigo threatened to swallow him whole. The man folded the tarp over Rusty's body, rolling him over and over until he was fully swaddled in plastic sheeting. He lay trembling, eyes closed, bracing for the next terrible thing. Many seconds passed in silence before Rusty opened his eyes. When he did, the man's face was millimeters from his own. We're going to play a game, you and me. Gonna make it last as long as we can. You don't know me, but you'll soon discover I win every time. The man stood and moved silently through the house, turning off the lights one by one until nothing but darkness remained. I owe you no explanation, Mr. Husk, so I won't be giving you one, said the voice from the void. A moment later, Rusty felt himself rising into the air, as if he were flying. It was a strange sensation, as though his entire body had sloughed away, leaving behind nothing more than a solitary head floating through space. Flashing orange and purple lights appeared as he drifted through the front door, past the empty rocking chair, down the front steps, and through his front yard. Over decorative gravestones with grasping hands before taking a sharp left into the dark driveway beside his house. A battered pickup sat waiting. The man threw Rusty into the back, his body landing with a clang on the metal bed. Footsteps crunched away. A door squeaked open and closed. A rumbling diesel engine growled to life. They drove beneath traffic lights, past billboards, picking up speed as they moved onto the highway. Stars blinked in the dark sky. A frigid breeze lashed his cheeks. Vibrations rattled up from the road straight into his skull, creating a tingle that descended into his throat, but went no further. After what seemed like hours, the truck slowed and went through a succession of turns. A fine dust flowed into Rusty's eyes, into his lungs, choking him as wheels crunched upon gravel. They were headed away from town, into the country, a fact made obvious by diminishing streetlights and bumpier roads. Rusty sensed something beside him, but was unable to turn his head to see what it was. The truck took a sharp turn, hitting a hole in the road, bouncing Rusty, knocking him onto his side. The sand in his eyes triggered a flow of involuntary tears, eventually clearing his vision. The object beside him jostled ever closer, until it was close enough for him to see what it was. It was Bertha. He hadn't seen her without the pumpkin head since he'd sealed her up tight and dressed her in overalls and a flannel shirt a full month ago. Her decomposing face was smashed against the transparent vacuum-packed plastic, her gooey sunken eyes open wide. Those vacant orbs stared at him, the mouth beneath them splayed in an eternal scream. He wanted to push her away, but discovered once again that he was helpless, unable to deter her relentless advance. Each bump in the road drew that vengeful countenance closer and closer, until at last her nose pressed into his cheek, those ghastly eyes glaring straight into his own. He attempted to knock her back with his forehead, but the brace around his neck was his master, unyielding. Unable to do much else, he closed his eyes and tried to escape inside his mind, seeking peace but finding only nightmares. Eventually, the truck slowed and rolled to a stop. The tailgate banged down. Rusty watched with relief as Bertha's hideous face slid away into the night. Finally, that ordeal was over, but he was certain another had just begun. Rusty lived in the big steel shed, in the far corner, away from the door. His body was bound upright to an old wheelchair that had been freed from a pile of rusty old medical equipment, apparently left over from a family member who'd once required extensive care. Rusty counted time for as long as he could, but eventually lost track as the relentless transition of darkness into light and light back into darkness blended into a single amorphous and never-ending day. The man, the farmer as Rusty had come to know him, had retrieved the Halloween decorations from Rusty's house, his tombstones and fog machines and glow-in-the-dark ghosts, and stacked them in the steel shed alongside him. Besides those decorations, his only company was a picture of the farmer and Bertha. The photograph of the couple was clearly taken in happier times, but it now hung on the wall at eye level directly in front of him. The brutal grip of the neck brace refused to let him look away from it, not even for an instant. At first, the sight of his possessions had made him hopeful. Surely his neighbors, especially Luther, would have spotted this man pilfering his property, would have realized he'd gone missing and called the police. But the cops never came, and after a while that singular hope fell as lifeless as the decorations themselves. The insects of the barn soon understood that Rusty's presence represented no threat. Spiders took up residence in the crevasses of his body, where they spun webs and laid eggs, grew old and died as their younglings spun fresh webs across his eyes and laid their eggs inside his ears. Each morning before sunrise, the farmer carried a leather bag and a cup of water into the shed, never speaking a word, never allowing Rusty's eyes to make contact with his own. The farmer would insert a straw into Rusty's mouth, giving him a single long sip of water. He'd fiddle with feeding tubes, replace the 4-drip bag, and swap out the gatherings from a catheter, after which he'd not be seen again until the next day. Rusty was more livestock than human, nothing more than another farmyard chore. When the farmer had first removed the tape from his mouth, Rusty had screamed and cried and threatened and begged. His reward had been the prompt replacement of the duct tape, forcing him to snort each and every breath through stuffy nostrils for another week. By the time the tape was removed once again, he'd learned his lesson. Rusty never uttered another word in the farmer's presence, though he sometimes spoke softly to himself when certain he was alone. After the chill of winter and dampness of spring had passed, the farmer would leave the door open during the day, allowing summer breezes to flow through the steel shed so Rusty wouldn't bake a lie. Occasionally, he'd spot the farmer, crisscrossing the fields atop some large piece of farming equipment or other, but never did he see or hear another soul. His hope of ever being rescued diminished with each passing day. Delirium overtook him as summer burned on. During these episodes, he ceded all grasp of time and space, of night and day, drifting in and out of consciousness, searing bouts of phantom pain his solitary tether to reality. When that agony struck, the nerve endings of his paralyzed body rematerialized, piercing and tearing him in places he would never again touch. He was powerless to escape the pain, to seek comfort, left to drench his foul flesh with tears until the torment receded and the phantasms of derangement returned to drag him away. His fevers decreased in frequency as autumn arrived, its coolness bringing the realization that almost a year had passed since his arrival. The harvest air, heavy with the scent of decaying corn stalks, reminded him of his Halloween scarecrows. Rusty couldn't resist reminiscing on those former forbidden pleasures, his beloved scarecrows from Halloween's past. Obtaining a scarecrow had been an annual pilgrimage for him, eagerly awaited. He'd carefully plotted his trips, traveling far, taking his time, covering his tracks. His final scarecrow, Bertha, had been procured from a gas station in a squalid part of a decrepit rural town. Even though she had only been one of many, he remembered that night so clearly. He parked in the shadows behind a grimy convenience store, positioning his rental so it was hidden from the street. He stepped from the car onto ground littered with wads of burnt foil and broken syringes that sparkled like jewels in the moonlight, evidence of drug abuse and reassurance that his choice was sound. He peeked into the women's restroom behind the station and found several filthy stalls, all empty as he'd hoped. After checking that no one was watching, he slipped inside. He believed a single man could make a difference in the world. He was doing something. He was making a difference. Although many Halloweens like this had come before, nervous excitement surged through him as he sat on the seat in the far stall. Waiting for his scarecrow to arrive was the hardest part, even if the anticipation was sweet. He hadn't tried a gas station bathroom before, wasn't certain it would work, but could easily feign confusion if discovered. At last the restroom door opened. A pair of petite shoes appeared below the divider of the neighboring stall. The moment had arrived. He stepped out of the stall and tiptoed to the restroom door. A single beat-up car sat outside. With a convenience store around front, the woman might not be alone. Rusty walked over to the occupied stall and kicked in the door, grabbing the woman from the toilet and pulling a thick black garbage bag over her head. He retrieved duct tape from his pocket and deftly bound it around her head 1, 2, 3 times, precisely positioned to seal her mouth and nose, then tightly around her neck 1, 2, 3 times, choking off her cries for help. He secured her wrists behind her. Each move was precise, skillful, practiced. He dragged the woman out to his car and stuffed her into the trunk, closing the lid, leaving her to asphyxiate. As he pulled away from the station, he checked his watch. 90 seconds had passed between the woman's arrival and his exodus. Not bad at all. He traveled down darkened back streets on a winding and unpredictable course toward home, away from surveillance cameras and potential witnesses, pleased to know that he was serving the public good, as would the new scarecrow in his trunk. Rusty had helped the community by removing another drug-addled leech from the streets and welfare rolls. This one was named Bertha, according to the driver's license he'd found in her purse. Now she would finally contribute to society, as had all his other Halloween scarecrows before her, by decorating his porch for the delight of law-abiding neighbors. Behind the dusty webs that draped over his face, a smile came to Rusty's cracked lips as he reveled in past pleasures, dreaming his dreams while tied to a wheelchair in the back of the shed. One morning that same autumn, the daily routine changed. The farmer slid the shed door all the way open, startling Rusty awake as metal screeched upon metal. The battered pickup waited outside, tailgate down. The farmer stacked Rusty's old Halloween decorations neatly into the truck and then came to collect Rusty himself, removing his 4 and catheter tubes, packing them back into his leather bag. The farmer sealed Rusty's mouth, placed a burlap sack over his head, and stowed him neatly alongside the rest of the cargo in the back of the truck. Rusty lay there until sundown, inhaling the stench of his decaying teeth, left to wonder what was going on. Was he being disposed of, put out of his unending misery? He hoped so. He'd had more than enough. Death would be a blessed release. Shortly after sundown, the truck rumbled to life. Through the dead of night they traveled, over potted roads and highways until the truck finally rolled to a stop. The tailgate thunked down and he felt himself flying again, Rusty the disembodied head, floating up out of the truck and into the darkness. Blind inside the burlap bag, he listened intently to the world around him. It had been so long since he'd heard anything more than the patter of rain on the roof of the shed or the chugging of tractors through the cornfields. It all seemed so foreign to him. Keys turning in a lock, a door opening, footsteps on a wooden floor, plastic sheeting crinkling against his face, the sounds painted pictures in rapid succession inside his mind. Artificial light loomed somewhere above. The farmer pulled the burlap sack from his head and walked away. Taking in his surroundings, Rusty wondered if he had died. He was inside of a house. His house. His heart leapt for joy, but landed with a thud as the farmer returned with a bale of hay at the end of one muscled arm, folded denim overalls and flannel shirt clutched in the other. As the farmer knelt down to dress him, Rusty's eyes came to rest on the kitchen counter. A freshly carved jack-o'-lantern stared back. I was so sad to hear about Rusty. Hard to believe it's been a year already. The man's gravelly voice was instantly recognizable. Luther, his old next-door neighbor. Excitement coursed through Rusty. He'd been waiting all evening to see if Luther would still make his annual Halloween visit. Massive stroke last Halloween. Dialed me as he was collapsing, I suppose, the farmer said, his voice strangely soft and caring. Didn't even get the chance to say why he was calling. I drove over to check on him later that night since he wouldn't answer my calls. Luther clucked as he listened. Rusty couldn't see the man's face from behind the pumpkin's triangle eyes, only the front of his shirt. Its color shifted from purple to orange and back again in the flashing Halloween lights. It was too late by the time I found him. The damage was already done, the farmer continued. Uncle Rusty never regained consciousness. Passed away last summer in the hospice. God rest his soul. Rusty didn't have much time. The conversation between the two men appeared to be wrapping up fast. He had to get Luther's attention, somehow get his neighbor to see him inside the scarecrow, see that he was still alive. Then Luther could slip away and call for help. If he was rescued, maybe there was still a way to reverse his paralysis, get him up and moving again. Would have been nice to say goodbye, Luther said. I know the community would have appreciated a proper funeral in return for all the fine things he did for us. I wish I could have made that happen, but consider this Halloween display to be a goodbye from Rusty, his final gift to the neighborhood. He loved Halloween, that's for sure, especially his scarecrows. You've done a fine job with this one here, I might add. A proper tribute, all right. The 4 bag's a nice touch. Luther wrapped the pumpkin head in approval, squatting to examine it more closely. As his neighbor peered into the jack-o'-lantern, Rusty found himself looking directly into Luther's squinty eyes. Rusty sucked in a big breath. It was his one shot for salvation. Damn, there are eyeballs moving around in there, Luther said. Rusty took that as his cue, letting loose the loudest moan he could muster. Even with lips sealed by duct tape, he could still make noise. Luther jumped back, clutching his chest. Goddamn. Now that's too fucking scary, he shouted. Pardon my French, but that thing should have a warning sign on it. You almost gave me a heart attack. The farmer laughed heartily, patting Luther on the shoulder. How do you make these scarecrows look so real, like they could jump right up and grab you? Sorry, Luther, but that's a family secret. Well, it was worth a shot, the old man said. Rusty was lucky to have such a fine nephew to put his affairs in order. Have a happy Halloween, son. I'd better get out of here so you can tend to these kids. And before this blasted scarecrow scares me again. With those words, Luther departed, almost taking Rusty's hope along with him. But he'd gotten a response. Luther had heard him. As Rusty sat on his own front porch for what he figured might be the last time, dressed in a flannel shirt and overalls stuffed with hay, head inside a pumpkin, face coated in black grease paint. He watched as daring trick-or-treaters gathered their courage to make their way through the flashing lights and billowing fog to confront him, the horrifying scarecrow. Relegated to being a passive observer, he was helpless, unable to intervene as the same kids he'd watched grow up over the years received sweets from a man he didn't even know. A man who had easily tricked his neighbors into believing he was family and taken over his house, over his life. The farmer grew bolder as the evening wore on. Amused by the elderly neighbor's frightened response to Rusty's cry for help, the farmer encouraged the children to peek inside the pumpkin for a surprise. It's blinking, one boy shrieked as he ran away, laughing, to tell the others about the horror he'd found the courage to face. As child after child peered into the pumpkin, Rusty tried to show them he was alive using only his eyes, afraid they'd be frightened away if he made noise. When the children leaned forward, he squinted his eyes, popping them wide open once they were looking, blinking furiously to show them he was real. But his efforts only made the children scream louder as they took flight. Halloween night came to an end. Once the candy ran out and the trick-or-treaters stopped coming, the farmer turned off the porch light, locked the front door, packed Rusty and the rest of the decorations neatly into the back of his truck, and set off on the long journey back to hell. That night back at the farm, Rusty found himself granted a reprieve from the hellish steel shed, from the unrelenting regimen of spiders and darkness, of days spent inhaling his own dank filth and decay. The farmer set Rusty the Scarecrow in a rocking chair on the creaky porch of his own modest home, placing the hollowed-out pumpkin back over his head. There Rusty remained all night, gazing towards where the moonlit driveway disappeared among fields of harvested corn. The next morning, the first rays of dawn fell upon an empty rocking chair. Farther off in the fields, a rapidly moving silhouette sliced into the sky. Elongated shadows scurried alongside the farmer as he strode amidst brown stalks and scattered husks. Rusty the Scarecrow tossed over one shoulder. Turkey vultures circled overhead, hissing as they followed. The farmer stopped when he arrived at a tall pole in the middle of the cornfield, where, at long last, he granted Rusty Husk the right to die.